issues, the boating community, I mean, as a constituency, the fishing community as part of a constituency of people who in some cases rely upon this for their livelihood water. This entire process is largely run out of the Office of Economic Development, as if the only function of this waterfront is for not even economic development as a whole, but for industrial and office space development.
Something that can be put anywhere in the city of Buffalo, and it's not that we don't have land, is that really light industrial and office space what we want on the waterfront.
It's a very different function to do waterfront development from traditional, I want to build an office park, help me access tax incentive kind of stuff. And so the waterfront process should be different. The Niagara Greenway could be a vehicle for which we do that. But even the Erie Canal Harbor Development Corporation, being created, which is the potential new home for all of the outer harbor land from the NFTA, is still a subsidiary of Empire State Development, entirely Albany driven by people who have sufficient political connections to be appointed to a large state, board. And so the process is not about what's best for the community. It's not about what does the community want. It's what does the state vision through Empire State Development want for the Buffalo waterfront for those who are connected enough to sit on the board.
But that only happens if we allow that to happen, and that's where the process problems take place. If we're all disjointed in a bunch of different groups fighting a bunch of different things, you can't win. If you're Byron Brown and you've got to make a decision and you're getting 12 different answers from 12 different groups, you're going to do whatever you want to do because you're going to lose no matter what. That's been the situation that we've been in, and that's why it's important for us all to get together and have a single plan, because then it's more difficult for this kind of stuff to happen. We get painted as obstructionists because we start lawsuits, but if you look at how these lawsuits ever come to fruition, they're because somebody started going down a path, didn't get the community input the way they're legally obligated to do so, actually broke laws in a lot of cases to get something done that they wanted to get done based on promises they made, whatever it was. And then we jump in and say, wait a minute, you didn't follow the process, you didn't involve the community, this is not what we're looking for, and you didn't follow the law, and then you try to work with them, and we tried very hard to work with Congressman Higgins and said, we don't want to do a lawsuit. That's the last thing we want to do. We'd rather work with you on having something happen. And, well, you guys are going to do a lawsuit anyhow, so we're just going to go forward with this. That's what we have to get away from. And I think if we can all get together, all agree what we need to do, educate everyone so they understand what the real issues are, it becomes a lot more difficult to start these little projects that are impacting everybody. The Inner Harbor thing with Bass Pro, people weren't against having Bass Pro. There was a big question of $25 million going to one entity and one developer and so forth. When it came to Bass Pro being a good idea or a bad idea, Bass Pro on the waterfront, somewhere as Julie's mentioning, is fine. It was where they were trying to locate it, which was in the middle of a location that was already mapped out, already funded, an existing development process that was already happening, and they decided to come in and stop that existing process to put Bass Pro in the middle of it. That's the kind of thing that we've got to be able to stop. It won't stop if it's one group fighting one issue and one group fighting another issue. We've got to look at the waterfront as a whole and all work together on having a single plan and making sure that the city of Buffalo and the region understands what that plan is, buys into it, loves the plan, and then everybody else has to interact with that plan.
And you might want to know why an at-grade boulevard. Very simply, an at-grade boulevard will provide for a grid of streets, and that grid of streets then creates a matrix for development. So you can't do that with an embanked Route 5, but you can do that with an at-grade boulevard.
Not to mention, too, that the current plan, including the access roads and the elevated section of the expressway, takes up a tremendous amount of usable land.
Right.
Not only is it a physical barrier, but it takes up waterfront land that can be otherwise used and be valuable and return value to the community.
For residential development, if you're on the other side of that big wall, you have no way of getting to the waterfront without having to take another big trek.
Is there a question in the back? No? Okay, last one. We need to wrap up. Amy?
Yes, two quick questions. I'm Amy from Buffalo First. One for Harvey. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the 7 to Save initiative and its potential implications for Peace Bridge. And then one for Julie. I want the room to be able to really understand the issue that you were talking about from more of a national perspective, especially in terms of like how we're making Buffalo a more competitive region in terms of like how our development is more community economic development oriented than traditional economic development oriented, particularly how we're getting back to development nationwide, and internationally, that is more people-centered and not car-centered. And I was wondering if you could tease that out a little bit for everybody.
Mine will be shorter. That was a lot of questions for Julie. When it comes to 7 to Save, that was a designation that we recently got in the Columbus Parkway neighborhood from the Preservation League of New York State, which is New York State's national trust. And they designated the Peace Bridge neighborhood area one of the 7 most endangered historic important areas in New York State. And that's very important. And they've done that because it's not just a bunch of cool old houses. The connections to the Ellicott street grid, the connections to the Olmsted Parkway system, George Washington even has connections. We have the Griffin, is it the Griffin? Some big boat that was built here a very long time ago.
LaSalle.
LaSalle.
It was the first ship to sail in the Great Lakes.
There we go. Was actually docked right there. There's connections with the Underground Railroad. You know, Ferry Street because of the ferry that went across. The history in that neighborhood, in addition to the wonderful history of the houses in the neighborhood, is very significant, and we've been eroding it for quite some time. I didn't bring slides that I can put up on the projector, but if you look at what the impact of the neighborhood was when the Peace Bridge first went in 1922, it was like almost a sliver of the neighborhood that was being taken up. It was very small and very reasonable. And then you look at the progression of how much of this neighborhood they've been taking over time, and then now this 45-acre thing that they're trying to do, they're eating this neighborhood up. So the 7 to Save designation is one of many steps that you'll see in the very near future that sends a message not just to the local area that this is important historically, but that also sent a pretty good message to the governor, who when he was here didn't mention anything about Peace Bridge or Route 5 in his State of the State. And he did that because he's starting to get the message that this isn't just a cut and dried issue. It's not just a couple of housewives. This is a pretty important discussion that needs to take place in our community.
Harvey, I just back you up on the importance of that. You talked earlier about the perception of the West Side as being, run down, and I mean, if this was like in the Parkside neighborhood, wouldn't even be having these discussions. Would not even be having these discussions. So I think that designation is very important.
And 5 years from now, the West Side will be considered as vibrant as the Parkside neighborhood. Different vibrant, cool, multicultural, mixed income, neat, but very viable and sustainable and healthy, vibrant neighborhood. We're just not quite there yet, and we haven't done a good job of communicating how much we've done already. I want to make sure that Julie gets to her questions because we're running out of time.
Really quickly, our water ties into, and our waterfront ties into our economy in so many different ways. And the state coastal policy, which Riverkeeper supports wholly, is that you need to use your assets for what they are most closely suited. And so, without question, we have to look at issues of how water actually ties into an economy. And it's strange because despite having 37 miles of shoreline and over 200,000 cubic feet per second of water flowing past our front door, the city of Buffalo does not have a single study that talks about what industries, what businesses rely upon water for their viability. We don't have the data. And so when we think about, again, doing our niche and our economic development stuff, we're not even prepared to do this piece. But we do know, for example, that water is an increasingly scarce commodity within the country and in the globe, that we've got a lot of it, that with the good wisdom of the state of New York passing the Great Lakes Compact and hopefully Congress by the time we start losing seats as a Great Lakes mass and after the 2010 census, that we'll be able to keep the Great Lakes here. And that's really important because we're looking at a different kind of economic model for Western New York. And it relies, as Amy said, on people and on information technologies and on creativity in solving really, really complex problems. We were just at a Power Authority meeting last week, and they're going to be spending over the next 5 years over $12 million doing habitat restoration projects on the Niagara River as part of their settlement, on top of all this greenway stuff. And as they do those projects, we're going to be generating knowledge, much like we generate knowledge for the health sciences complex, on how we actually take an ecosystem that's been severely compromised and restore maximum function. But there's no medical corridor kind of system around it to turn that into jobs for Western New York. There's no connection to the engineering community or to the academic programs.